You think you know humanity. You have seen the documentaries, scrolled through the photographs, and convinced yourself the world holds no more secrets.
The Arctic air doesn't just bite, as it carries a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight. For generations, the Inuit elders have been the master timekeepers of this frozen world, reading the stars like a map, etched in diamonds across a velvet sky. But a few years ago, that silence was shattered by a terrifying realization. The sun was rising where it shouldn't. The stars had migrated. For the first time in millennia, the horizon was lying. What they witnessed gave them definite goosebumps. When the sun cheated. In the high Arctic communities of Nunavut, specifically in places like Igloolik and Pangnirtung, life is governed by a strict, unforgiving, celestial rhythm. When you live in a world where the sun disappears for months at a time during the polar night, its return is not just a seasonal event. It is a sacred reappearance that signals the survival of the collective. For thousands of years, the Inuit marked the exact notch in a mountain range or the specific tilt of a snowbank where the first sliver of the sun would return. This was their new year, a moment of profound spiritual and practical importance. Then came the year the sun cheated. In 2010, elders, men and women who could navigate a white-out blizzard by feeling the direction of the wind against their cheek began to notice something unsettling. The sun was peeking over the horizon kilometers away from its traditional post. In Igloolik, one elder, Augustine, noted that the sun had returned to a position that was visually shifted southward by nearly 19 kilometers compared to where it had been in his youth in 1957. To a Westerner, 19 kilometers might seem like a manageable discrepancy, but in the precision-based world of Arctic navigation, this was a 44-degree movement relative to the observer. It was as if the very foundations of the planet had slipped. The elders observed that the sun was not only rising in the wrong place, but was staying in the sky for minutes, then hours, longer than the ancestral calendars dictated. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was a fundamental shift in the geometry of their world. Imagine waking up in your own bedroom and finding the window has moved 3 feet to the left. That was the goosebump moment, the realization that the ceiling of the world had been shifted by an invisible hand. The warmth of the sun felt different too. It was more direct, more piercing, as if the veil between the earth and the fire of the stars had thinned. When these elders spoke to researchers, they didn't speak in terms of degrees or axes. They spoke of the great change. They described how the wind had changed its tongue, blowing from new directions and carving the snow into strange, unrecognizable shapes. For a culture that uses sastrugi, the wind-blown ridges in the snow, as a compass, this was catastrophic. If the wind changes its pattern, the map of the ground is erased. And if the stars, which hunters used as a GPS for night trekking across the sea ice, appeared to have slipped, then the map of the sky was erased too. Hunters began to report terrifying near misses. They would set out across the ice, following the star that does not move, or specific constellations like Orion's Belt, known to them as Ulaktut, only to find that the celestial markers were leading them toward open water, or treacherous leads in the ice that shouldn't have been there. If you follow a star that has moved, you don't just get lost. You walk into the abyss. The stakes were life and death, and the message from the elders to the scientists was clear and unwavering. The Earth has tilted on its axis. The scientific community's reaction was a mix of awe and deep, professional discomfort. On one hand, you have the most sophisticated satellite arrays in human history, GRACE satellites that can detect the weight of a single cloud, and GPS systems that track the Earth's movement down to the millimeter. These instruments insisted the Earth's axial tilt remained at its steady 23.5 Celsius. On the other hand, you had an entire culture of people whose survival depended on 5,000 years of unbroken, daily observation saying, the sky was broken. These are people who do not use tools to tell time. They are the tools. The discrepancy created a scientific ghost story. If the Earth hadn't tilted, why was the sun appearing in the wrong place? Why were the days suddenly longer? The elders were adamant. They weren't reporting a theory or a political stance. They were reporting a lived reality seen with their own eyes. They watched the sky with the intensity of a jeweler looking at a flaw in a diamond. To them, the wobble was as real as the ice beneath their boots. This was the moment the Arctic shock began to ripple through the global scientific community, setting the stage for a collision between indigenous wisdom and Western physics. It forced a haunting question into the minds of everyone involved. Is it possible for the human eye to see a truth that a billion-dollar sensor misses? Or is the planet changing in ways our technology isn't yet calibrated to understand? The elders described the feeling of environmental gaslighting, the sense that the universe itself was no longer following the rules. They told stories of how the old weather was gone. In the past, they could look at a cloud and know exactly what the weather would be in 3 days. Now, the clouds scattered differently. The light had a different quality, a sharper, stranger hue. This wasn't just climate change in the abstract. This was the collapse of a predictable reality. The shock didn't just come from the cold. They came from the realization that the most stable thing in human history, the path of the sun across the sky, had become a stranger. To find the answer, scientists had to stop looking at the ground and start looking at the very air the Inuit breathe. Keepers of the night. So why do elders' claims send such a visceral chill through the scientific community? One must first dismantle the modern conception of navigation. For a Western traveler, finding one's way involves a needle pointing north or a digital screen calculating coordinates from a satellite. But an Inuit hunter operates on a different plane of reality. They possess a cognitive map so intricate that it functions like a biological supercomputer, woven from the threads of wind, snow, and light. This is the language of the ice, a sophisticated system of environmental literacy passed down through oral tradition for 5 millennia. When an elder says the sky has moved, they aren't guessing based on a fleeting sensation. They are reading a ledger that has never been wrong. At the heart of this ancient navigation system are the sastrugi, the wave-like ridges of snow carved by the prevailing winds. To the untrained eye, a snowfield is a chaotic, featureless white void, a blank page of terrifying proportions. To an Inuit navigator, it is a topographical map written in relief. They know the exact angle at which the tongue of the snow should point based on the time of year and the position of the stars. By feeling the texture of these ridges through the runners of their sleds or the soles of their boots, they can maintain a straight line for hundreds of miles in a total whiteout. However, the elders began to report that the tongue of the snow had twisted. The winds, once predictable and steady, had become erratic, coming from directions that defied ancestral memory. This meant the very ground they used to find their way was being rewritten. But the most haunting discrepancy lay with the stars, specifically the ones they call the keepers of the night. In the Arctic, where the sun vanishes for months, the stars are not just distant lights. They are life-saving beacons. The Inuit use specific celestial alignments to determine their position on the shifting sea ice. One such marker is Ulaktut, Orion's belt, which serves as a crucial guide for timing the hunt. For generations, the transit of these stars across the sky was as reliable as the beating of a heart. When hunters began reporting that these stars were appearing higher or further left than they should be, it wasn't just a curiosity, it was a crisis of reality. Their celestial compass was spinning, and the awe came from the realization that the stars they had trusted to bring them home were now leading them into the unknown. This level of observation is what scientists call traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. While Western science relies on snapshots, data points collected by sensors at specific intervals, TEK is a continuous, multi-generational stream of data. An elder doesn't just know the sky today, they carry the collective memory of what the sky looked like in 1920, 1850, and 1700. They are trained from childhood to spot the slightest deviation in the shimmer of the horizon. In a world where a 5-minute error in judging the sun's return can mean the difference between life and death, precision is the only currency that matters. To suggest they are mistaken about the position of the sun is akin to telling a master pianist they are misidentifying middle C. If the Earth's tilt was fixed at 23.5 degrees, then what force was powerful enough to move the sun in the eyes of an entire people? Scientists question. When the reports from the Inuit elders reached the hallowed halls of global space agencies and meteorological institutes, the initial reaction was not one of alarm, but of profound professional skepticism. In the world of Western science, the Earth's axial tilt, the 23.5 Celsius lean that gives us our seasons, is a fundamental constant. It is monitored by a global network of very long baseline interferometry (VLBI) stations and a constellation of GPS satellites that can detect a movement as small as a few millimeters. According to every piece of high-tech equipment available to NASA and the European Space Agency, the Earth had not moved. The axis was stable. The North Pole was where it had always been. This created a jarring paradox. Scientists were faced with a choice: believe the sensors or believe the people who had lived on the land for 5,000 years. The data was unequivocal. If the Earth had tilted as far as the elders described, enough to move the sunrise by several degrees or stay in the sky for an extra hour, the global consequences would have been apocalyptic. A shift of that magnitude would have triggered massive tectonic upheavals, displaced the world's oceans, and rendered every satellite navigation system on the planet useless. From a purely mathematical standpoint, the tilted Earth theory was impossible. Yet, the scientists couldn't ignore the source. These weren't casual observers. They were the world's most accurate human sensors. Researchers began to scrutinize the Inuit testimonies with a more clinical eye. They started looking for a middle ground, a way that the sun could appear to have moved without the planet actually shifting. The surprise in the scientific community didn't come from the fear of a tilting planet, but from the realization that something was happening in the Arctic atmosphere that was effectively hacking human perception. The investigation turned toward the archives of global observatories. Astronomers confirmed that while the stars were in their correct mathematical positions, the visibility of those stars in the Arctic was changing. This was the moment the skepticism began to transform into a new kind of curiosity. Scientists realized they were looking at a massive, regional anomaly that was bypassing their global sensors because it was happening within the very medium through which we see the world, the air itself. The tension lies in the clash of two different types of truth. There is the objective truth of the satellite and the subjective, lived truth of the hunter. For years, these two truths remained at odds. The scientists argued that the elders were perhaps misremembering or that their eyes were being tricked by the aging process. However, the elders fired back with a simple, haunting observation. The sun is hot on my skin in a way it never used to be. This was a data point that no satellite could refute. It suggested that the atmosphere was no longer just a window, but a lens that was starting to focus and distort energy in ways that modern science had not yet mapped. If the planet hadn't moved, what was happening to the light itself that could deceive the eyes of an entire civilization? Error in the numbers. To solve the riddle of the shifted sun, scientists had to stop looking at the Earth's core and start looking at the very air the Inuit breathe. The answer lay in a complex, hauntingly beautiful, yet deeply unsettling optical phenomenon known as the Novaya Zemlya effect. While the Earth's axis remained fixed at its mathematical constant of 23.5 Celsius, the atmosphere itself was beginning to act like a colossal, unintended lens. As the Arctic warmed at nearly 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet, it created the perfect conditions for a massive increase in thermal inversions. In a standard atmosphere, air temperature drops as you gain altitude. However, in the rapidly changing Arctic, a layer of unseasonably warm air often becomes trapped on top of a layer of much colder, denser air that sits directly against the ice. This creates a temperature sandwich. When the sun's rays hit this boundary between cold and warm air, they don't pass through in a straight line. Instead, they hit a wall of differing densities and are refracted, bent downward, following the curvature of the Earth for hundreds of miles beyond the normal horizon. This isn't just a simple mirage like the shimmering heat waves you see on a desert road. It is a geometrical distortion that projects the physical image of the sun into the sky when the actual star is still hidden miles below the curve of the planet. For the Inuit elders, the wow factor was entirely justified. They were literally seeing a ghost. The sun they observed rising days earlier than expected was a phantom sun, a projected image created by a warming atmosphere that was now behaving like a funhouse mirror. This effect can make the sun appear as a flattened, rectangular shape or even a series of stacked glowing bands, which explains why the elders reported the sun looking different and strange in its very structure. The scale of this deception is staggering because it is constant. As the Arctic air has become more stratified due to the loss of reflective sea ice and the absorption of heat by the dark ocean, this atmospheric lens has grown stronger and more frequent. This explains the specific mystery of why the sun appeared to have moved south, or why it stayed in the sky longer. The light was being stretched, pulled, and ducting across the horizon, creating a distorted view of the entire solar system. Scientists realized that the elders weren't mistaken about their world. They were the first human witnesses to the physical rewriting of the Arctic's optical properties. The warming climate wasn't just melting the ice beneath their boots. It was bending the very light of the stars above their heads, making the celestial map unreadable to those who had followed it for 5,000 years. This atmospheric hacking goes far beyond a single sunrise. It affects the perceived positions of the moon and the stars, shifting them by degrees, enough to throw off a hunter who has navigated by the same constellations since his childhood. In this new, distorted Arctic, the air is no longer a transparent window. It is a thick, refractive medium that vibrates with trapped energy. The scientists were shocked to find that the error the elders reported was, in fact, a precise measurement of how much the atmosphere had changed. The elders were noticing changes in the refractive index of the air that were so subtle they were initially ignored by global weather models. The wobble wasn't in the Earth's spin, but in the path of the photons traveling through our sky. It was a moment of profound realization for the scientific community. We have altered the chemistry and physics of the planet so deeply that even the stars can no longer tell us the truth. This creates a world where the horizon is constantly lying to you. When the elders say they see the sun in the wrong place, they are accurately reporting a broken reality. The atmosphere is now essentially gaslighting the people who know it best. The Inuit are living in a landscape where the light is no longer a reliable narrator of time or space. The thermal inversion layers have become so persistent that the Novaya Zemlya effect, once a rare polar curiosity, is now becoming a daily feature of the Arctic sky. As the hunters look out over the tundra, they are seeing a sky that has been physically re-engineered by carbon. The light that hits their eyes has traveled through warped layers of heat and moisture that didn't exist when their grandfathers were young. This is the true horror of the story. It's not that the planet has tilted, but that we have changed the very air until the universe itself appears to be tilting. We have turned the sky into a hall of mirrors, and the Inuit were the first to notice that the reflections were starting to scream. But if the sky is an illusion, what does that do to the psyche of a people who define themselves by their connection to the horizon? The sun as a stranger. When the fundamental truths of the physical world begin to dissolve, the impact is not merely scientific or logistical, it is deeply psychological. For the Inuit, the sky change created a profound sense of environmental gaslighting, a state where your own eyes tell you one thing, but the rules of your reality insist on another. The fact reported by scientists didn't just come from the chilling physics of light refraction. They came from witnessing a culture in the throes of a spiritual and mental crisis. What happens to a people when the sun, the most constant entity in human existence, becomes a stranger? In the Inuit worldview, the environment is not something separate from the self. It is an extension of the community's collective soul. Their language, Inuktitut, is filled with hyper-specific terms for ice and wind that have no English equivalent because their very identity is tied to the predictability of these elements. When the elders realized they could no longer trust the stars or the sunrise, it triggered a phenomenon known as solastalgia, the distress caused by the transformation and loss of one's home environment while you are still living in it. It is a form of homesickness, where the home itself has left you. Imagine the psychological weight of a hunter standing on the edge of the ice, staring at a horizon he has known for 60 years, and feeling a sudden, paralyzing wave of vertigo. The landmarks are there, but the timing is wrong. The light is the wrong color. The shadows fall at angles that feel alien. This is the core of the Arctic shock, the feeling that you are standing on a different planet. One elder described it as a feeling of being unmoored, as if the anchor of the North Star had been cut and the entire Arctic was drifting into a void where the old maps no longer applied. This disconnection leads to a breakdown in the transfer of knowledge. For millennia, the elders were the absolute authorities of the tundra. Their word was law because their word was based on the immutable laws of the sky. But as the sky began to lie, a generational rift opened. Elders became hesitant to teach the youth how to read the weather or the stars, fearing that their ancient wisdom would lead the younger generation into a fatal trap. This silence is perhaps the most tragic consequence of the atmospheric shift. It is the sound of a 5,000-year-old chain of survival snapping in real time. The psychological toll is also reflected in the physical health of the community. When the sun returns too early, it disrupts the biological rhythms of a people who have evolved to live in the extremes of light and dark. The wrongness of the sky creates a persistent state of low-level anxiety. It is the feeling of waiting for an earthquake that never ends. The scientists who stayed in these communities reported that the goosebumps were contagious. It was impossible to sit in a room with a master navigator who is genuinely afraid of the sun and not feel a shiver of existential dread. It was a stark reminder that when we break the climate, we don't just break the thermometer, we break the human spirit's connection to the universe. As the Arctic sky warped, a new question emerged. Was this localized optical illusion a symptom of an even larger, more physical wobble affecting the entire globe? A planet in flux. While the shifted sun, reported by the Inuit, was largely an atmospheric mirage, the scientific investigation into their claims coincided with a series of genuine physical anomalies that were beginning to rattle the global scientific community. The elders' intuition that something was off with the Earth's balance wasn't just limited to the air. It tapped into a deeper, more literal truth about the planet's stability. In the years following the Inuit reports, researchers began to realize that the Earth was, in fact, experiencing a measurable shift in its distribution of mass, a phenomenon that was physically moving the North Pole. For decades, the geographic North Pole had been drifting slowly toward Canada. However, around the turn of the millennium, it took an abrupt and dramatic turn. It began racing toward the British Isles at a speed nearly double its previous rate. When NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory analyzed the data from the GRACE satellites, the same ones that initially seemed to contradict the Inuit, they found a startling culprit: the massive melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. As billions of tons of ice turned into water and flowed into the oceans, the Earth's weight was redistributed. This mass migration was significant enough to cause the planet to wobble on its axis, a process known as polar motion. This physical wobble, though measured in millisecond seconds and not visible to the naked eye like the Novaya Zemlya mirages, added a layer of profound irony to the story. The Inuit were witnessing an optical shift caused by heat, while the planet itself was undergoing a structural shift caused by that same heat. The reality was no longer just for the elders. They belonged to the geophysicists. They realized that the Earth is not a rigid marble, but a dynamic, sensitive organism. When we melt the poles, we are literally changing the way the world spins. This shift is so precise that it can even alter the length of a day by a fraction of a millisecond. Furthermore, scientists began to track a separate, equally concerning anomaly: the rapid migration of the magnetic North Pole. Unlike the geographic axis, the magnetic pole, the one your compass points to, has been sprinting away from the Canadian Arctic toward Siberia at an unprecedented pace of about 55 kilometers per year. For the Inuit hunters, who have always lived at the top of the world where magnetic lines are most volatile, this meant that the traditional relationship between their local environment and the global magnetic field was being severed. The rules of the North were being rewritten from the core to the crust. This narrative bridges the gap between the mirage and the reality. It suggests that the Inuit weren't just seeing a ghost in the air, they were sensing a planet that was becoming physically unbalanced. The warming of the Arctic had created a double blind. On the surface, the air was bending light to create a false horizon, while deep within the Earth's mass, the distribution of water was altering the planet's very rotation. Both phenomena were symptoms of the same fever. The elders were the first to scream that the room was spinning, and while the scientists initially checked the floorboards, they eventually realized the entire house was tilting in the wind. The fascination here lies in the scale of the feedback loops. The melting ice causes the wobble. The wobble slightly alters the distribution of sunlight over millennia, and the changing atmosphere creates the mirages that the Inuit reported. We are looking at a planet in a state of high-speed transition. The Inuit reports acted as a canary in the coal mine, alerting humanity that the most stable constants of our existence, the position of the poles and the path of the sun, are subject to the whims of a changing climate. It was a moment where the woo-woo of a tilted Earth met the hard, cold data of geophysics, and the truth was more complex than anyone had imagined. As we stand on this new, trembling Earth, what does the marriage of ancient observation and modern data tell us about our future? The Silent Witnesses. The story of the Arctic tribe and the shifting sun is more than a mystery of light and ice. It is a profound testament to the power of human observation. For years, the Inuit elders stood as silent witnesses to a planetary transformation that our most advanced sensors were not yet tuned to see. They didn't need satellites to tell them the world was out of balance. They felt it in the sting of the sun on their cheeks and saw it in the wrong shadows stretching across the tundra. By the time science caught up to explain the Novaya Zemlya effect and the physical redistribution of the Earth's mass, the Inuit had already been living in that new reality for a decade. This collision of indigenous wisdom and Western physics leaves us with a lingering sense of goosebumps because it humbles us. It reminds us that despite our digital mastery, we are still deeply connected to the ancient rhythms of the Earth. When those rhythms break, it is the people closest to the land who feel the vibration first. The Arctic shock was a wake-up call from the edge of the world, a warning that the horizon is no longer a static line, but a shifting boundary. As we move forward into an uncertain climatic future, we must learn to listen to these silent witnesses. They are the cartographers of a changing planet, teaching us that while the stars may seem to move, the real shift is happening within our relationship to the world itself. If you liked this video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more. Thanks for watching.